What if the first permanent English settlement in America wasn't a story of perseverance, but of desperation, arrogance, and horror? What if the very roots of English America were watered not in triumph, but in blood, famine, and cannibalism? When you think of Jamestown, maybe you imagine bold settlers carving out the beginnings of a nation, or perhaps the Disney-fueled vision of Pocahontas and John Smith, a tale of friendship bridging cultures. But the truth is far darker. Imagine this: over 500 men, women, and children crowded behind wooden palisades, surrounded by fertile forests and rivers teeming with life, yet starving to the point of madness. Imagine gnawing on boiled leather straps, scraping marrow from bones dug out of graves, even carving flesh from the body of a child to stay alive another day. This is not myth. This is not exaggeration. Archaeologists have confirmed it. And the question that echoes through history is this: how could England, one of the most powerful nations of its day, send its people across the ocean only to see them nearly destroy themselves in the midst of such abundance? To understand Jamestown, we need to understand England in the early 1600s. Spain had grown rich from colonies in Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean. Galleons laden with gold and silver crossed the Atlantic, filling Spanish coffers. England wanted the same. But England was late to the game. Colonization required not just courage, but investment, so the Virginia Company was formed, a joint stock company where wealthy investors pooled money with the promise of enormous returns. The sales pitch was simple. The New World was filled with gold, silver, and resources waiting to be seized. All one had to do was stake a claim. In December of 1606, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, set sail with about 104 men and boys. The passengers were not chosen for survival. They were chosen for profit. Gentlemen who had never worked a field in their lives sat side by side with artisans, craftsmen, and a handful of laborers. But what they lacked most were farmers and women. Think about that. The very first English colony intended to be permanent was launched without the basic skills or structure needed to build a real community. From the start, Jamestown was an experiment in wealth, not survival. When they arrived in May 1607, they picked a site about 60 miles up the James River. On paper, it seemed strategic, easy to defend, with deep waters for ships. In reality, it was a swamp, brackish water, full of salt at high tide and fouled by human waste, bred dysentery. Mosquitoes carried malaria. Summer heat and humidity made the air heavy, and the winters were cold enough to kill those without proper shelter. Within months, nearly half of the colonists were dead. And yet, even as men starved and disease spread, many still spent their days scouring the soil for gold. The irony: they had settled in the midst of the Powhatan Confederacy, a network of more than 30 tribes ruled by Wahun Senakau. Chief Powhatan, his people had farmed these lands for centuries, growing corn, beans, squash, and tobacco, fishing the rivers, and hunting the forests. To them, this was home. To the English, it was a wilderness to be conquered. But the question remains: why would England, with all its power, send its first colonists without farmers, without women, without the tools to thrive? The answer is arrogance. The English didn't come to build a society. They came to strip wealth from the land and sail home rich. Inside the palisade walls, chaos reigned. Jamestown was plagued not only by hunger and disease, but by class divisions. Many of the gentlemen refused to lift a hand to labor, believing work beneath their station. In their minds, Their role was to lead, not to dig ditches or plant crops. Others, unskilled in farming, had no idea how to cultivate the land around them. Instead of planting corn, they searched for gold dust and precious minerals, convinced riches were just beneath their feet. One colonist later admitted they spent months digging gold instead of planting corn. As conditions worsened, survival came to rest on one man, Captain John Smith. Unlike many of the settlers, Smith had no illusions of grandeur. He had been a soldier, a mercenary, and an adventurer across Europe, hardened by campaigns in Hungary and Turkey. He understood survival. Smith imposed strict discipline. His decree became infamous. He that will not work shall not eat. It was simple, but effective. He forced the idle to labor, organized defensive structures, and most importantly, established trade with the Powhatan. Corn from native farmers kept the English alive. But Smith's leadership was not without controversy. He was brash, arrogant, and often heavy-handed in his dealings with both colonists and native leaders. The famous tale of Pocahontas saving him from execution. Likely not true. Most scholars believe Smith misinterpreted a ritual adoption ceremony or exaggerated the story to inflate his own importance. Regardless, Smith's leadership provided order, and his departure in 1609 after a gunpowder accident marked a turning point. Without his harsh discipline, Jamestown fractured. Leadership became unstable. The colony was already weak. Now it was leaderless, vulnerable, and unprepared for what came next. The winter of 1609 to 1610 is etched into history as the starving time, and for good reason. 500 settlers entered the winter. By spring, only 60 remained alive. What happened? Supplies had dwindled. Powhatan warriors, increasingly hostile to the English who raided and demanded food, cut off access to hunting and foraging. The colonists were trapped inside their wooden fort, watching the forests and rivers just beyond their reach while their stomachs twisted in hunger. At first, they slaughtered the livestock, horses, pigs, and cattle. Then came the dogs, cats, and eventually rats, mice, and snakes. They tore leather from their boots, boiling it in desperate attempts to create something edible. But hunger has a way of erasing boundaries. Desperate men dug into graves, exhuming corpses for sustenance. Written accounts confirm it. One settler admitted in a letter that nothing was spared to maintain life. In 2013, archaeologists uncovered chilling evidence. The remains of a 14-year-old girl nicknamed Jane, her skull bearing clear knife marks. Her bones told the story. Skin and flesh were cut away. Marrow was extracted. The evidence was undeniable. Cannibalism had occurred. By the end of winter, corpses littered the ground, and the survivors were skeletal, hollow-eyed, and broken. Of the 500 who had entered that winter, fewer than 1 in 8 survived. Imagine that for a moment. A colony that should have been wiped from the map, reduced to almost nothing, clinging to survival by the thinnest of threads. Jamestown's survival, fragile as it was, depended on the Powhatan Confederacy. In the early years, trade provided lifelines. Corn and venison exchanged for copper, beads, and tools. But the English never viewed the Powhatan as equals. They demanded food, sometimes threatening violence. When trade failed, they raided villages, burning homes and fields. The Powhatans saw through the illusion. The English weren't temporary guests. They were invaders. At first, Wahunsenakau tried diplomacy. His daughter, Matawaka, later remembered as Pocahontas, was sometimes present as a messenger, though far from the romanticized image history later gave her. To the English, she became a convenient symbol of harmony. To the Powhatan, she was a pawn in fragile negotiations. Tensions boiled. As the English demanded more land for tobacco and more food for their swelling numbers, conflict was inevitable. Powhatan warriors harassed Jamestown, cutting off supplies, laying siege during the starving time. For the colonists, it was terrifying. For the Powhatan, it was defense. Here lies the cruel irony. Jamestown would never have lasted its first years without the aid of the Powhatan. Yet the English came not to coexist, but to dominate. Despite what history books tell us, Jamestown was less a permanent colony than a series of near-death experiences strung together by chance. Every shipment from England brought more settlers, often gentlemen or adventurers who added mouths to feed without contributing survival skills. Supplies from across the Atlantic trickled in, but never enough. Disease stalked the fort. Hunger returned each year. Violence with the Powhatan flared in cycles of uneasy truces and bloody reprisals. The colony was a revolving door of death. One visitor described finding skulls and bones scattered across the fields, a grim reminder of the price paid. Jamestown was not a thriving settlement. It was a death trap, kept alive only by England's refusal to admit failure. In 1610, after the devastating starving time, the remaining colonists finally made the decision to abandon the settlement. They boarded ships, ready to leave Jamestown behind forever, a failed experiment written off to history. But fate intervened. Just as they were sailing down the James River, they encountered new reinforcements arriving with supplies and fresh settlers. The governor ordered them back. Jamestown, already dead in spirit, was forced back to life. Its survival was not triumph, it was accident. Jamestown's true salvation came not from discipline, not from leadership, and certainly not from gold. It came from tobacco. John Rolfe, an English settler, began experimenting with strains of the plant, eventually cultivating a version that Europeans craved. Tobacco thrived in Virginia's soil. Suddenly, Jamestown had its cash crop. But this lifeline came at a price. Tobacco exhausted the soil, requiring constant expansion. Expansion meant encroaching on Powhatan lands, sparking more violence. And tobacco demanded labor, endless labor. In 1619, a ship carrying Africans arrived in Virginia. At first, some were treated as indentured servants, their status uncertain, but over time, their bondage hardened into race-based slavery. That same year, the colony also established the first representative assembly in English America, the House of Burgesses. Within a single season, the colony had set down two of the most enduring, contradictory legacies of American history: representative government and slavery. Tobacco ensured Jamestown's survival, but it did so by creating a plantation economy dependent on land, labor, and exploitation. The colony was no longer just an outpost. It was the birthplace of systems that would shape America for centuries, both its ideals and its darkest realities. So why do we remember Jamestown as a success? Why do textbooks call it the birthplace of America, when for years it was little more than a death trap sustained by chance and exploitation? The answer lies in myth-making. Nations prefer triumph to failure. The story of Pocahontas and John Smith, polished into romance, became more palatable than tales of cannibalism. The idea of brave settlers persevering against the odds became more inspiring than the truth of arrogance and desperation. But the reality cannot be ignored. Jamestown did not survive because of English strength or ingenuity. It survived because of constant resupply, because of the generosity and later the resistance of the Powhatan, and because of the eventual discovery of a cash crop that transformed land and labor into commodities. Its true legacy is complex. It gave birth to representative government in America, but also to slavery. It represents the beginning of English colonization, but also the displacement of native peoples. And it reminds us that the foundation of America was not built solely on ideals, but also on exploitation, violence, and survival at any cost. Jamestown was not a fairy tale. It was America's first failed experiment, an experiment that staggered forward, not in triumph, but in desperation, reshaping itself into something very different than its founders imagined. So now you know the true story of Jamestown. It wasn't a shining example of freedom or perseverance, but a colony teetering on the edge of collapse, rescued only by desperation, accident, and exploitation. Was Jamestown really the birthplace of America, or was it a warning about arrogance and the dangerous cost of profit-driven ambition? What do you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.